Shalom and welcome to the Israel Policy Pod. I'm Neri Zilber, a journalist based in Tel Aviv and a policy advisor to Israel Policy Forum. We have a big episode this week with our good friend Amos Harel, the defense analyst and correspondent at Haaretz, back with us to discuss the latest inside and outside the IDF, including the new chief of staff, Eyal Zamir. Who is he? What are his plans? The state of the army now 17 months into this war, the prospect of a renewed offensive into Gaza, or not, and the IDF's investigations into the failures before and during the October 7th attack. Lots to discuss as always, but first, a few thoughts from me. So we're recording this Monday evening Israel time, and as I discuss with Amos later on, the Gaza ceasefire for hostage talks are about to resume in Doha, Qatar. Will they succeed? No one knows. Believe me. I've tried to get an answer to that very, very question, but let's take stock of where we're at and where we may be going. First, the ceasefire's so-called first stage ended about 9-10 days ago, and as we all know, there was no follow-on second stage agreed, but the fighting hasn't restarted, and that's a good thing. The various actors are giving more time for diplomacy and for talks, hence Doha. Second, what are those talks going to deal with? Best I can tell, there are two nominally separate but related tracks, both being promoted by the Trump administration. The first track, led by U.S. Special Envoy Steve Witkoff and endorsed by the Netanyahu cabinet, seeks to extend a ceasefire through Ramadan and Passover, i.e. till mid to late April, in return for the immediate release of half the remaining hostages, so something like 30 people, and the start of talks over the elusive second stage. That was the original idea as we understood it, which was a pretty good idea for Israel, and if you're Israel. Hamas, for the record, rejected it, but there may be wiggle room and quote-unquote flexibility on the exact details of the Witkoff proposal, or the Witkoff framework, as some have taken to calling it, that could entice Hamas to at least keep the ceasefire going. All right? That's the first track. Second track, which has become very public and very contentious over the past week, is being led by U.S. hostage envoy Adam Boehler. Boehler made waves, it's fair to say, in recent days when it was confirmed that he was actually negotiating directly with Hamas officials in Qatar. And let's all just take a brief moment to think what the reaction would be if the Biden administration had sent someone to do the exact same thing, to sit face to face with a Hamas official in Doha. But I digress. Boehler is trying to get a deal that, depending on the day, either gets only the 5 American dual nationals out of captivity, including Idan Alexander, who is still alive, thankfully, or maybe he's going for something bigger and more akin to the deal that was being discussed on the Witkoff track. The main point, and the third and final point, is that the U.S. is directly negotiating with Hamas for the first time ever. Israel isn't happy about it, and there is at least the perception, if not the hope, that Donald Trump is trying to do an end around Bibi Netanyahu and get a deal done over Gaza and for the hostages at all costs. Now, I have my doubts whether this is his true intention, and whether it's even going to work. There's still major gaps and many inherent contradictions in what the U.S. and the Trump officials are alleging Hamas could, might, should accept. Not least Hamas laying down its weapons. But here we are, waiting to see how far the U.S. president, like with everything else, wants to take this. Let's get to Amos Harel. Hi, Amos. Welcome back to the podcast.
Hi, Neri. Thanks for inviting me.
It's always my pleasure and our pleasure, Amos. But it's hard to believe the last time you were on was way back in October, if you can believe it. It was a very different situation in the Middle East and the war and the world back then. No ceasefires yet in Lebanon or Gaza, and Donald Trump had yet to win the U.S. general election, let alone actually become president again. But I wanted to start here, Amos, a bit closer to home and a bit more recent. The big change that happened 6 days ago here in Israel was the early end of Herzi Halevi's tenure as IDF chief of staff and the entry and assumption of the position by Eyal Zamir, the new head of the IDF. That position and a new person is a big deal even in normal times, but Obviously, these aren't normal times, so it's an even bigger deal now. I'll throw out, just by way of context for our listeners, a few biographical details about Zamir. He's a former deputy IDF chief of staff who in the past, I believe, lost out on the top job at least once, maybe more than once, Amos. You can correct me. For the last few years, he was also the Director General of the Ministry of Defense, which is a big and important job. And then finally, he was, in the even more distant past, the military secretary of Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu. So Amos, first question to you. What do the listeners need to know? What should they know about Eyal Zamir?
Well, he's a career military professional. He's actually in uniform since 9th grade. He went to a military training school when he was 14. So a career in uniform was something that he always had in mind. Started in a tank corps, was a company commander, battalion commander, brigade commander, division commander. Always seemed quite professional, never somebody who was destined to be necessarily chief of staff, unlike Halevi. He didn't come from an elite unit like Sayeret Matkal or the paratrooper brigade. These are the two main sources for chiefs of staff of the Israeli army in the last 30 or 40 years. And yet had quite a successful career. When in 2023 he lost to Halevi, it was not a big surprise. Netanyahu now tried to say last week at the ceremony in which Zamir had been sworn in that he wanted Zamir twice as a chief of staff, and things didn't work out. This is not exactly the case. He entertained the thought that Zamir would become chief of staff, but never pushed forward, was never in his corner enough to have Zamir being appointed. But life is sometimes full of surprises, and this terrible surprise of October 7th meant that Herzi Halevi, the so-called prince, the designated chief of staff since he was in his mid-20s, had to leave office. Herzi stepped down a few weeks ago under quite a massive political pressure from Netanyahu and Defense Minister Katz. And I think Zamir was the likely and logical alternative. He has all the necessary capabilities or the right character for the job, if you like. And B, he wasn't directly involved in the fiasco. As you said, he was Director General of the Ministry of Defense, but this is somebody who's not involved in day-to-day decisions about the way you operate the force, the way you deploy units along the Gaza border. And naturally, he wasn't involved in the discussions and the fateful morning hours before Hamas struck. This is the main reason why people like Halevi and head of Shin Bet, Ronen Bar, are considered responsible for what has happened, the mistakes made through that night and morning hours before Hamas struck on 6:29 a.m. Zamir was sleeping at the time. He had nothing to do with that.
That's right. And unlike many of the other generals in the general staff, many of whom either have gone home or will likely be going home pretty soon, Zamir was untouched by the abject failure of October 7th. And I think it's also fair to say, Amos, that out of all the potential candidates that Netanyahu and Defense Minister Israel Katz could have come up with, Zamir was maybe the most responsible choice, the most professional and straightforward choice?
Yes, that's true. The only question mark, so to speak, had to do with his relationship with Netanyahu that you mentioned. He was his military secretary, and there's a tendency to think of officers who serve directly under Netanyahu as possible Netanyahu puppets. There has been a lot of gossip about Netanyahu and the Netanyahu family at large involved in discussions about promotions and appointments for military officers, head of Shin Bet, head of Mossad, and so on. It got to a point in which Sarah Netanyahu herself was deeply involved in such decisions. And therefore, it's quite natural that the political camp who opposes Netanyahu looks at Zamir with quite some suspicion. Now, in reality, Zamir was never a puppet. He never groveled to Netanyahu. He never, as far as I can tell, never had a special relationship with Sarah Netanyahu. So this is not the case. And yet, judging from his first few steps and decisions during the first few days of his term, this is going to be extremely difficult territory. Everybody is looking at him, observing every move he makes from both sides of the political fence. And it will be very, very hard for him to make everybody happy under the current political and military circumstances. This is making his job practically impossible.
So you beat me to it. That was my follow-up question. His first, 6 days in post. Obviously, there are professional decisions he's taken, but obviously in the overall context of a very politicized IDF environment. And to that point, one of his first, if not his first decisions, and by far his most controversial decision, was the, shall we say, forced retirement of IDF spokesperson Daniel Hagari. And I'm sure our listeners know that name. Hagari became really the face of this war for many Israelis and even people outside of Israel, especially given the abject and sheer lack of any other governmental figure coming out and speaking to the public like adults, even in very difficult times like Iranian missile attacks, the deaths of hostages, death of soldiers, which was almost on a daily, morning basis, as we know, Amos. So how do you assess Zamir's first 6 days, especially in light of the Hagari decision?
I'd call it assisted resignation, if you'd like.
Okay.
Hagari it's the Hagari scandal or the Hagari case by now. As you've noted, I think he's one of the only officers who performed well on October 7th and continued to do so all through the war. Hagari is a former commander of the Navy SEALs, quite a brave officer and fighter, extremely popular among the Israeli public because of his conduct, because he insisted on appearing while others were hiding, especially Netanyahu himself. You could see that all through October 7th. But later on, think of this terrible Friday night on mid-December 23, when the IDF shot by mistake 3 hostages who somehow miraculously, in a magical way, managed to escape from their Hamas captors. And then an IDF unit shot them dead by mistake. Of course, Netanyahu disappeared, but neither was Halevi very interested in speaking to the public that Friday night. It was only Hagari who was willing to give the Israelis this piece of very bad news. And that was quite typical of him. I think he was a very brave and courageous officer, not only in his conduct on enemy beaches or in the various battles far away from Israeli borders, but also the way he performed as an IDF spokesperson under very extreme and difficult circumstances. His problem was perhaps that he was too good at his job and perhaps too popular. And for some reason or other, he was also identified or misidentified as a sort of a leftist by the Netanyahu crowd. And the BB channels, especially Channel 14, were on his case for quite some time, looking for every slip of the tongue, every statement that may have a hint of some question marks regarding the government's policies and positions and so on. That's what has happened. And last December, Yaakov Bardugo, who is a mouthpiece for the prime minister and sometimes pretends to advise him on different matters, actually threatened Defense Minister Katz that if Katz even thinks of promoting Hagari to a 2-star general after he finishes his term as IDF spokesperson, then there will be hell to pay. So, of course, Katz took note, and I think there was at least some, if not direct pressure, then indirect pressure and some hints to Zamir that he could not promote Hagari and that he should perhaps speed up Hagari's farewell to uniform. Now, Hagari himself, being so good at what he did, expected promotion. But when he spoke to Zamir, it turned out that Zamir had other ideas, and Zamir actually told him, go and do another job away from the cameras and the microphones as a brigadier general. So 1-star general for 2 years, and then we'll see. For Hagari, that was too little and too late, and he decided to resign. I think both of them miscalculated regarding this. But the end result was a scandal. And since everybody, as I said, is so suspicious and the atmosphere is so divisive and everything is divided into pro-Netanyahu or anti-Netanyahu, immediately the reaction was from the right, good riddance, and from the left, they stabbed Hagari in the back. It is all Sarah's fault and so on. The truth is somewhat less dramatic or spectacular, and yet this is the way people see it. And I think it's unfortunate both for Hagari, who deserved a better ending for his military career, and for Zamir, who, there's no second opportunity to make a first impression. And he made a very bad impression on parts of the Israeli public.
Yes, it was unfortunate, and especially given the fact that out of all the IDF generals, Hagari deserved promotion, given, like you said, the fact that he performed admirably from that morning and for the past 16 months, explaining what was happening to the Israeli public and the world. Not a great end to his military career. Bigger picture, Eyal Zamir, the first 6 days, what else has he done? I saw, just based on the announcements, that he has, canceled a lot of leave for serving soldiers. He wants soldiers on bases, on alert. He wants to set up a new tank armored brigade. He wants more infantry units. He promoted 2 individuals, one to IDF Southern Command, responsible for the Gaza Strip, and then another officer to head up the IDF Operations Directorate. So the two posts who actually will run a war in Gaza if it's restarted. So what else have we seen from Zamir in recent days?
I think basically, which is there's nothing new about that. The tendency among new chiefs of staff is always back to the basics, especially after a failure in war. The best example I can give is Gabi Ashkenazi after Dan Chalutz's failure or relative failure in Lebanon II, the war in 2006 that more or less ended in a miserable draw. And Chalutz was pushed out. At that time, there was a national committee that investigated the fiasco. And Ashkenazi, who was in a quite similar position to Zamir, also Director General of the MOD, also lost the battle for the first battle or competition for Chief of Staff, and then was called in to save the army, so to speak. What he did at that time was, okay, let's pretend that this is a new army. Let's pretend that these are old times. Everybody needs to be very disciplined. We'll check everything. We'll question everything. We'll accept nothing for granted. And, we'll make everybody train very, very hard. And from then we'll start improving. And I don't know if that ever achieved all its goals, but one goal was, quite realistically achieved, and that is that the Israeli public was convinced that the army has recovered and improved. And Zamir, of course, is trying to do the same. The difference between Zamir and Ashkenazi is that these are even more trying times. First of all, the fiasco, of course, is 10 times bigger in 2023 to 25 than it was in 2006. And secondly, the challenges remain huge. It's true that Ashkenazi himself had to deal with the preparations for the attack on the Syrian nuclear plant on September 2007, less than a year after he became chief of staff. And yet Zamir has problems of his own, the possibility that the war would resume and so on. So since he's a back to basics kind of guy, for instance, he's going to open up a new tank brigade. Some tanks that were prepared to be destroyed will be put back into action, in spite of the fact that these are relatively old Merkava-free tanks. There's talk of building a new infantry unit, perhaps that will be, again, another reserve brigade. And again, talks of a lot of training and so on. And yet the challenges, as I said, are much more extensive this time. Just think of the sheer numbers. The IDF planners have already told the Knesset that they need somewhere around 12,000 soldiers, fighters for the army, in order to fill in spaces that were created by the war, whether it is dead soldiers, soldiers who were injured and did not return to uniform, or soldiers suffering from PTSD or some kind of psychological issues who are not willing to come back and fight. So these are serious matters for the IDF. And then the bigger picture is that perhaps sometime very soon Israel would find itself again battling Hamas. So he needs to prepare the operational plans for a possible new war with Hamas. And of course, being the new guy, he has to promise at least to deliver better results than Halevi. And so he's prepared the new plan, which is much more aggressive, involves the use of even more firepower and quite a few brigades and divisions in order to reinvade the Gaza Strip, and this time teach Hamas a lesson it won't forget. Now, if you ask the residents of the Gaza Strip, they've learned a lesson. I don't know what it is exactly, but we're not going to forget it anyway. And yet the expectations from Zamir is that this is going to be something else. And of course, behind this lies the even bigger picture, strategically or politically speaking, which is the Trump administration's support. The Israelis assumed that Trump would not tie our hands the way Netanyahu blamed Biden for doing, and that we will have full American support for use of deadly force, for use of heavy, accurate ammunition that Trump is willing to supply after Biden's de facto embargo, use of D9 Caterpillar tractors, something that the army necessarily needs, that wasn't used recently because of another weapons embargo. So the assumption is, at one point or another, the ceasefire may break. It will be hard to reach a new hostage deal. And in that case, the IDF will get the green light to finally try and wipe Hamas off the face of Gaza. We'll see how this transforms, how this plays out. I'm not optimistic. I think it's much more difficult than people are misleading themselves to believe. And I think that the results for everybody could be devastating, but first and foremost for the hostages. You know that there are 59 remaining hostages. Mm-hmm. Somewhere around 20, 22, 24 are alive. These are not high numbers, and yet others could die. And one of the things that we've learned from hostages coming back is that the Israeli intelligence community had it wrong many times. It assumed that hostages were held in certain places, while at the same time they were somewhere else. So how can you be sure, if you go back to war, that we don't kill our own, or that Hamas does not murder our hostages if it suspects, like it happened in Rafah in August, mm-hmm. that Israeli forces are close to releasing hostages by force?
So you won't find any disagreement on my end, and probably from many of our listeners, that those two war goals set out at the very start by Netanyahu and many others at the very top of the Israeli system, that you can both destroy Hamas militarily and release all the hostages. Those are likely binary choices, very difficult to achieve both of them. The vast majority of the Israeli public, the vast majority, wants Netanyahu and the government to go for a deal. We'll get to that in a second in terms of the prospects for continued ceasefire and hostage deal, Amos. But I wanted to unpack two things that you touched on. Number one, the something else. Eyal Zamir, the new chief of staff, likely a new or changed IDF general staff, making preparations, promising renewed force being applied on Hamas. It seems like you're a bit skeptical with regard to the newness of these plans and also the effectiveness of whatever they're cooking.
Yes, that's true. Look, we've applied enormous force in Gaza. We weren't too indiscriminate about using force, and sometimes it wasn't really clear what we were doing. We talked about that in the past. I'm not sure if last October, but it was quite clear almost from the start that the two main goals of the war were not synchronized, especially when you talk of timelines, because if you want to defeat Hamas, apparently it takes a very long time. While on the other hand, the hostages don't have all the time in the world. And we know, the New York Times just published it, that about 40 hostages died in captivity, some murdered intentionally by Hamas, others died of illness, and others also died because of mistaken Israeli bombings. So how can you make sure that more hostages would not die if the war is renewed? So this is a basic problem. And of course, another problem is that the declared goals of the campaign are perhaps not the real political goals, because if you ask Smotrich, for instance, he has other plans. I think they're much more interested in retaliation, not to say even, I'd say, direct revenge against Hamas and perhaps the Palestinian people at large in Gaza. They're more interested in bringing back Gush Katif and the settlements in Gaza. And if they have it their way, and for a time they actually believed that they were going to get what they wanted from President Trump, they also want forced immigration from Gaza of most of the Palestinians there. They presented it something else as an agreed upon, mutually agreed immigration and so on. But in fact, this is what they're seeking to achieve. And this is very, very different than the goals that are described to the public. So if we were in Zamir's shoes, what is he actually trying to achieve? The real goals of the campaign, the declared goals of the campaign. And he has to consider the fact that there's this attrition has been going on for quite some time. Again, 17 months of fighting. Think of reservists who served 250 to 450 days in uniform, people who were torn away from their families, came voluntarily in the beginning, believed in what they were doing. But many of them are beginning to suspect that the people above them in the chain of command don't necessarily know how to solve this. And this is devastating for an army in the long run. Again, if you look at the need for more soldiers and the government's absolute refusal to find solutions such as forcing the ultra-Orthodox to the draft and to be serving in the army, then how do you square this circle? How do you actually demand even a heavier burden from those soldiers who are serving, and on the other hand, don't send any reinforcements to help them succeed in reaching their military goals? So this is a very difficult problem. It's true that to an extent, Hamas is weaker than it was before. The IDF learned how to fight better than before. Hezbollah has practically been defeated. This is why Hezbollah is not looking for a new confrontation up north. So the IDF would probably need to have less forces deployed in the future in the north while it's fighting in the south, unlike the beginning of the war. So there are some positive developments, and yet it remains a very, very hard challenge, a very, very hard goal to achieve. I think that Zamir knows it, and I would assume that he secretly hopes that he doesn't need to implement his plan. Right now, he needs to go through the motions to show that he's serious, to show the people who appointed him that he can deliver. And yet I would assume that in his heart of hearts, he hopes not to be tested in Gaza.
So that's very interesting, Amos. And you beat me to the second point that I wanted to unpack with you, which was precisely that point of IDF manpower and the attrition after 17 months of war, both the standing army and the reservists, and also in the context of not just the potential renewed offensive in Gaza needing, 3, 4, 5 divisions, right? If you're going in bigger and heavier, but also upholding buffer zones and territory in southern Lebanon, southern Syria now, the northern West Bank. There's still an ongoing IDF operation there. So, how shall I frame the question? Obviously, you're concerned about the attrition and the well-being of all these combat soldiers, but if push comes to shove and the ceasefire talks don't actually prove fruitful and they break down, when Zamir presses that button, will the divisions actually show up, do you think?
Look, some of them would. And remember that our echo chamber is probably different than the right wing's echo chamber. The fact that, forgive me for releasing too much private information about you, but the fact that you live in Tel Aviv and the people you see there doesn't necessarily represent all of the soldiers who fight in combat units everywhere in Israel. Okay, I'm not sure, not to make too many assumptions about you, but I'm not sure how many of your close family are in fact settlers from the hardcore settlements around Nablus, who
it's
happen
a fair
to serve
assumption,
in the army as well. Yeah. So anyway, we're all in an echo chamber of our own. So it's true that both of us have met reservists, Miloimniks, who said enough is enough. If they go back to fighting and they're risking hostages' lives, I'm not going to show up this time. And yet there are others who would happily come and are just waiting for another opportunity to make Hamas pay for what it did on October 7th, or are dreaming of another Gush Katif, new settlements in Gaza. But I think that because I know already that in certain units there are just 50% of the reservists are showing up recently, I think this would become a bigger problem if there's no consensus behind the war. And remember, in most of these months of the war, in spite of growing concerns and in spite of an absolute lack of belief by much of the public in the government's good intentions, there was still wide support for the war itself. There was a difference between supporting the deal and hating Netanyahu's guts and coming out against the war. It was only the hardcore left, some of it post-Zionist, who publicly said this war is wrong and should not be continued anyway, without a connection to the hostages question. I think this is becoming more of a problem. I think that soldiers with liberal views, so to speak, will have a harder time showing up. I think the IDF is facing a problem, and yet I'm warning us both in advance of this echo chamber that could mislead us to conclusions that may be wider than the actual reality. But for the time being, it doesn't seem that they care. I've read Smotrich's statements this morning telling reserved soldiers that they should be alert because we will call you very soon in order to reinvade Gaza. And he's happy about that, of course. The same guy yesterday, he's the treasury minister, of course, and he said yesterday that he started doing a math out loud of how many Palestinians you could force out, or in his way, in his terms, convince to leave Gaza on a daily basis. He said, well, we can do 10,000 a day and 7 days a week. Suddenly Shabbat is not a concern when you come to forced immigration of Palestinians from Gaza. He's living in a world of his own. Now, you could have said, okay, this guy's radical, borderline crazy, if you'd like, not my cup of tea, what do I care? But this guy is actually behind many of the decisions. The fact that he could blackmail Netanyahu because Netanyahu so desperately needs him to stay in office and inside his coalition in order for his government to survive means that in spite of this minimal support Smotrich enjoys at the moment from the public, he's very, very influential on the way the government is thinking and actually its decision-making during the war.
Undoubtedly, we all know this, and I'll put this carefully and gently, that when you talk to people close to the prime minister, well, they're also very convinced that a renewed offensive is needed to destroy Hamas, and they also took Trump's plan for the quote-unquote emigration, voluntary or otherwise, of Gazans quite seriously. Now, with everything having to do with Netanyahu, is this a spin? Is this one part of a bigger play? I don't know, but this is what you hear, not just from the Smotrich types at the very top of this Israeli government. Okay, we'll be right back after this brief message.
At this critical point of the war in Gaza, Israel Policy Forum is providing timely updates on the hostages' Phase 2 negotiations and questions surrounding the future of Gaza. Last week, we published a report outlining the serious reforms required to create a functional Palestinian Authority that can effectively govern the Palestinian territories and oversee Gaza's reconstruction. This is key to sidelining extremists like Hamas, enhancing regional stability, and laying the groundwork for a viable two-state outcome while addressing Israeli and Palestinian security needs. Co-authored by Ibrahim Dalalsha, Shira Efron, Jess Manville, and Gabriel Epstein, the report lays out a roadmap for the US, Israel, and the PA to follow. Be sure to follow us on Instagram, Twitter, and Blue Sky to view our updated timeline tracking the hostage releases and for broader analysis on the war in Gaza and Israeli-Palestinian affairs. If you rely on Israel Policy Forum for credible, nuanced analysis, please make a gift today so that our work can continue to have an impact. Donate now at ipf.li/supportthepod or at the Support the Show link in the show notes.
in fairness to Eyal Zamir, Amos, and you know this, Zamir gave a speech in 2021, I believe, as he was finishing up his term as IDF Deputy Chief of Staff, where he warned about this trend towards a smarter and smaller IDF based on, technological means and tools. And he actually said that it shouldn't come at the expense of a larger force, and definitely a larger ground force needed to fight a multi-front war as we're facing right now. So credit to Zamir for identifying that years ahead of October 7th. Quite prescient on his end, no?
Yes, he's as I said, he's somewhat traditional, somewhat old school in his views.
He's
of
Armored
the
Corps.
battlefield.
Tank commander.
Exactly. And he tends to look at things differently than the guys who grew up in elite commando units, who are fascinated with technology and with specific, accurate, precision-depending operations behind enemy lines and so on, which is great, but it's mostly about boutique capabilities. In the end, I think he knows that what you need is the metal. What you need is the actual platform to fight upon or from. And this means tank, this means artillery, this means planes, this means armed personnel carriers and so on. And Zamir was deputy chief of staff under a guy who was recently quite forgotten because he makes a point of staying out of the picture, which is, of course, Aviv Kochavi, the former chief of staff. He had two deputies. One was Zamir, the second one is Halevi. It's always the joke among the top brass that almost always will the second deputy under a chief of staff's term become his successor. And the same happened with Halevi, who, as I said, was considered more talented as well. But for Zamir, it was a very frustrating time because Kochavi was exactly the kind of man who was thrilled by technology, thrilled by developments, and didn't feel so much importance, didn't see the old school as that important, felt that these were different times and that much could be achieved mostly by using the Air Force and the intelligence corps. So Zamir, like some other generals in uniform and without uniform, warned of these developments and said, we will need the old school. We will need those tanks. And now he gets to say, what's the best thing for a Jewish person to have, to get to say, I told you so. And he's actually in a point to implement his conclusions, to learn a lesson, not only learn a lesson, but to teach others and make them act accordingly. So this is
right.
This is where we are right now. And I think he's right about that. I'm always worried about this, this tango of back and forth, one step forwards, two steps back. There's always the danger that things could go wrong, that we may be stuck in the same place while our enemies are already preparing something different. And again, I would stay clear of, conclusions that are ultimately decisive about everything. We know for sure that the Hamas had won this because we were, too slow to adapt or too traditional or too forward thinking or whatever. There's always a mixture of developments and reasons for everything that's done. And yet it's quite clear for everybody that this was a step too far, the way Kochavi was thinking, and that some of the reasons behind the fiasco on October 7th is that line of thinking.
Sure. I thought you were going to go a different way, Amos, hearkening back to 1973 and after the Yom Kippur War, where defense spending skyrocketed precisely because of the abject military failure, and that led to major economic issues, especially
the
in
lost decade.
1980. Yeah, the lost decade. And also, the Lebanon War and nearly 2 decades of occupation. But we don't have time for that. To get into all that on this podcast, maybe in a future podcast. Amos, I'd love to get your thoughts on the ongoing hostage talks, which we touched on earlier. So we're recording this on Monday evening, Tel Aviv and Hod HaSharon time, and another round of negotiations are set to begin today and tomorrow in Doha in Qatar over the fate of the Israeli hostages and the ceasefire in Gaza. I guess we'll have to wait and see what happens. I think the sense among some people that I've spoken to is that a partial deal that extends a ceasefire for several more weeks and gets out more hostages, not all the hostages, but at least some of the hostages, may be possible. But Hamas obviously has a say and may have other ideas and demands. Are you optimistic or pessimistic that some deal can be had in the coming days and weeks?
Look, I'm slightly more optimistic than I was, Neri.
Okay.
Yeah, that too. And again, I
More
wouldn't
optimistic,
take it very far. Yeah,
more optimistic than dinner last night, Amos?
Yeah, I think gradually things are moving in a possible better direction. And we've seen the Trump administration being able to deliver. It's true that phase one of this deal was always going to be easier to implement than phase two. And now we're getting to the problematic stuff, whether it's in the eyes of Hamas releasing Israeli soldiers who were abducted, or in the eyes of Israel releasing some very dangerous terrorists, people who were lethal, people who were involved in the killings of the murders of dozens, if not hundreds, of Israelis during Second Intifada. Maybe the release of some of the Hamas terrorists who were involved in the massacre of October 7th. I'm not sure if that's on the table or not. So this is going to be hard to do. And then you have the actual facts on the ground. Would Israel agree to evacuate all of the Gaza Strip? Would Hamas remain in power? What about control? Would Hamas be able to maintain its weapons? There are many, many questions here. And yet, in spite of the mixed signs that the Trump administration is sending, and they keep talking, these guys never stop talking on camera. There's not much difference between what they say behind the scenes and what they say in the Sunday news shows or in Washington, or the Monday evening news edition in Israel. And yet somehow my feeling is, and again, I could be entirely wrong about this, because who in the world is crazy enough to try and foresee where Trump is heading? But my sense is that this is at the moment quite important for Trump, and that he has leverage over Netanyahu. So if I go back to the details of the currently discussed deal, 59 people have remained in Gaza, 59 hostages, somewhere above 20 is the number of alive hostages among them. And the discussion right now is what kind of an agreement could be reached in order to release all of the 59. I think basically during the Ramadan period and perhaps during the Passover period. So up to April 19th, as long as the ceasefire is kept. Now, of course, this is not the sentiment you hear from Smotrich. Perhaps this is not what Netanyahu wants. What Netanyahu wants more than all is the survival of his coalition. But Trump wants something else, and I don't think he still has the eye on the ball. His eyes are on the ball, and the target, the goal is quite clear. It's a full-scale deal. It's the end of hostilities in Gaza, perhaps a removal of the Hamas regime. It's a release of all of the hostages, and that will make way for what's really important to Trump, which is the Saudi deal. The Saudi deal means a lot of money, hundreds of billions of dollars to American economy, but a large chunk of this to the family, the future of both the Trump and Kushner families. And that depends on some kind of an agreement, some kind of normalization between Israel and Saudi Arabia. And that is crucial because, as we said in the past, Trump is interested in achieving the Nobel Peace Prize this year. The list ends or closes somewhere in October. So he doesn't have much time. And if he wants to do that, he's already proved that he can force both Hamas and Netanyahu to sign a deal that neither of them were very happy to sign just 2 months ago. And I'm pretty sure that if he looks at this, he thinks to himself, yes, I did it once. Why couldn't I do it again? I'm the best negotiator in the world. I'm the best mediator in the world, the best businessman. This is no different from any other real estate deal that I managed in New York or in New Jersey or whatever. And this is what his man Witkoff is about. Adam Baller is somebody completely different. He's a real estate guy, not as well known as Witkoff or Trump. He's new to the scene, to us. We only started listening to what he said in recent days, and he had quite a lot to say. And apparently, I feel that the most important piece of news in the last week or so is our colleague Barak's Ravid scoop on Axios, discovering that the United States, in fact, opened up a back channel with Hamas, direct talk, something that would have been unimagined under the Biden administration. And that Boller, in fact, was discussing with Hamas a deal behind Israel's back. And that's an important development. We'll see where this is heading. But right now, I would guess from that what Trump is up to is reaching a deal almost by any means necessary. And if his good friend Netanyahu gets caught in the crossfire somehow, then so be it. This is not the most important thing for Trump. It doesn't mean yet that he's able to deliver. There are many, many challenges here, many, many obstacles. But for the time being, this is where I think he's heading. Again, having said that, never underestimate Netanyahu and his ability to change things at the last moment.
It's interesting. I'm maybe a bit more skeptical than you, Amos, that even Trump can get a real kind of stage 2, a full deal for a ceasefire and a full hostage release. I think we're likely to get something in the middle that pauses the war for another month or two and gets some hostages out, but not all the hostages. And we'll be probably having this conversation after Pesach, Amos. But even that, I think, would be a welcome development given the alternative that we discussed, which is a wholesale return to the war.
Yeah, I'm not saying that this is in any way a sure thing. I'm only saying that this is, considering the latest events, I'm saying that this is a possibility.
Yeah, I mean, look, everything is possible. If you had told someone before Barak Ravid's report that the U.S. was directly negotiating with Khalil al-Khayeh, the Hamas official in Doha, it would have been very hard to believe and to stomach, and yet Trump just did it. Trump just sent his guy to do it for reasons known only to him. Final topic that I wanted to bring up with you, Amos, the IDF investigations into October 7th that have come out fast and furious over the past 2 weeks. We should say before Herzi Halevi finished in his post. It was a really strange process, wasn't it? Where basically they're briefing the reporters, the army is, like you and I, who then report the findings of the various inquiries out in their various media outlets. And then it's the public's role is to read the reports about the inquiries done by the IDF on things like the intelligence failure the night before October 7th, the strategic misconception going back years vis-a-vis Hamas and the Gaza Strip, and the failure of various battles on the day of October 7th in southern Israel. So I'm very curious to get your sense, Amos. What did you make of these inquiries so far? And again, they're not done. There's still more to go. And did anything really jump out at you or surprise you by what the army put out, given what we've already known for the better part of a year?
It's not only IDF, but also Shin Bet, although Shin Bet was not giving as much details. But I spent no less than 30 hours split upon between 4 days of briefings regarding, I can't remember by now, but I think these are about 10 different investigations out of 80. And there are more coming this week. And I find it important. It's important for me, but to an extent, it's important for the Israeli public as well. I think we need to know. And I think it helps with context and with colors, if you'd like, with details of what has happened. There hasn't been something that rocked me to the core. So much has happened and we've learned so much since October 7th that it's hard to imagine that somewhere there's a certain fact hiding that would change our perspective about everything. And yet, when you talk to so many people who spent thousands and thousands of hours of work trying to build this huge jigsaw puzzle and understand what was going on, I think as a reporter, it's good for us. It helps us understand what has happened. I now feel as if I read a book about the war. It doesn't mean that everything they say is necessarily completely accurate. There are interests and so on. What I would take from this more than anything else, I think, is has to do with the timeline. We talked about that in the past, that the whole issue, of course, is this total surprise on 6:29 a.m. We know that the chief of staff and that the head of Shin Bet were awake since 4 o'clock, that there were discussions, deliberations, and so on, but that nobody on the Israeli side figured out that Hamas was in fact going for the whole thing. Actually, in spite of the fact that at one point or another, the military intelligence, Amman, were able to steal Hamas' plan of attack, they never took it seriously and never prepared for something like 5,000 terrorists crossing the border at 100 different places from Gaza Strip at the same time. And the end result of that, of course, was that a manpower that included only 770 combat soldiers, that's Saturday morning on October 7th, that was the whole army, so to speak, deployed along the Gaza border. These are only 2 active battalions. It had to be 4, but 50% of the soldiers were sent home on holiday for Simchat Torah, because naturally our enemies are going to respect that and never attack us like they never did Yom Kippur in 73. So just look at the sheer numbers. 770 Israeli soldiers taken by complete surprise, many of them sleeping in their beds on 6/29. And on the other hand, you have around the first 3 waves of attack, you had somewhere between 5,000 and 5,600 Hamas terrorists crossing the border. So this was not a fair fight in any way. In spite of Hamas being the weaker side, Hamas was able to perform what the professionals call a basic surprise. And that's something huge. Think Pearl Harbor, think 9/11. In our terms, this is bigger. Think of a population of 10 million that loses close to 1,300 people within a few hours. And the problem, of course, is once this tsunami hits you, it takes a long time to recover. And most of the damage was done between 6:30 and 12:30. By 12:30, most of the mob and most of the terrorists were back home with their prey. Many others were killed. Some stayed and were killed later. But by the time the IDF was able to actually deploy its reinforcements and change the actual number, the balance of power, by then most of Hamas's fighting force was safe and sound back home in Gaza with 251 Israeli hostages. And that's the if you'd like, this is the core explanation for the whole thing. Too little reinforcements, too late, and within a few hours, most of the damage was already done. So it took a long time to recover control and to clean up, so to speak, the kibbutzim from the last bastions of resistance from the Hamas side. And later on came the actual realization of what a terrible thing has happened. And since then we're stuck. We have managed to inflict a lot of pain and suffering and death on Hamas and on the Palestinian side at large. But we haven't changed the face of the war. It has not ended in Israeli victory. It will be very, very hard to change this outcome, considering what has happened. And considering the fact that for a long time, what everybody thought was that this was the strongest army in the region, and that Hamas was a group of terrorists, barefooted men with AK-47s and perhaps some rockets, who could do no serious damage to Israel in any likely scenario. Once all of these assumptions were smashed on October 7th, then everything changed.
Yeah, everything did change, and you're right. I mean, the entire kind of collapse of the Gaza division and the IDF really in southern Israel and also beyond southern Israel, right? Even the chain of command going up to Tel Aviv and the Air Force weren't functioning for many, many hours. For me, that was the scary part. You know, you can make an intelligence mistake and not take Hamas seriously and everything we know and obviously learned from the inquiries that were confirmed. But the fact that the IDF wasn't able to push them back and really defend Israel proper, for me was a scary part. And I'm sure you, like many other Israelis and maybe other people outside of Israel saw the show on Channel 12, Uvda, Fact, basically Israel's 60 Minutes, 2-part episode on the battle for the Nahal Oz base on the Gaza border. And it's unbelievable, right? Because these aren't defenseless civilians, but they were almost defenseless soldiers in many respects. I mean, there were many soldiers who fought and died bravely at that outpost. But just the footage of the IDF trying to stem this tsunami coming out of Gaza was harrowing and shocking to me.
That's true.
Amos, we're going to have to leave it there. Thank you so much for coming on. Even I know you're a bit under the weather, but even 90% of Amos Harel is better than 110% of many other people. So drink some tea. I hope you get some rest, and hopefully we'll speak to you soon.
Thanks, Larry.
Okay, thanks again to Amos Harel, as always, for his generous time and insights. Also, a special thanks to our producer, Jacob Gilman, and to all of you who support Israel Policy Forum's work. Do consider making a donation to Israel Policy Forum so we can keep being a credible source of analysis and ideas on issues such as these that we all care deeply about, including this podcast. And most importantly, thank you for listening, and Ramadan Kareem for all those celebrating.